The Holy Gospel according to John, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again," the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. I did it again. I had fully intended, because of the length of that gospel reading, to invite you to be seated before I started reading. And then I got into it a ways, and I thought, anyway, apparently we all survived. There was a couple who were planning their wedding. And as they were in the process of planning, the bride and groom spent some time thinking about the scriptures that are often suggested for weddings. Some of them you know very well. Others may be a little more obscure. But as they thought about those scriptures and as they thought about the shape of the service, it was going to be a very small gathering. It was going to be just their close family and maybe a very few very close friends. Fewer than 40 people all together. And this gathering was a gathering that, as they were thinking about what this wedding would look like, and as they were thinking about what scripture might be appropriate, frankly, none of the suggested readings seemed to fit. Now, the bride had been divorced, and the groom was a single father, a single parent, and had been for quite a few years. And somehow none of the regular texts seemed to make much sense. But as they thought about each of those people who were going to be invited and indeed would be in attendance, they started to think about ways in which each one of those people over the years had spoken or done things that helped them to be ready for the surprise of this relationship. You see, when they went on that first date, they had both had enough, disappointments in looking for a life partner that they really didn't expect much of anything from that first date. And yet, what had emerged, and it was surprising, was a relationship that had been a bit of a whirlwind. And so as they thought about that, they found themselves starting to think about this story of the raising of Lazarus. Now, let me tell you, the raising of Lazarus is not a typical wedding scripture. It's not something that we hear in weddings often. And there's good reason for that. First of all, even as they came and talked to their pastor and said, we're thinking this is the scripture, and here's some of why, they also knew that there's no way to tell this story short. We need to hear the beginning of the story where Jesus is still away from Jerusalem, and he gets the word that his friend Lazarus is ill and on the verge of death. And he says, this is about God's glory being revealed. We need to hear this story of God's glory revealed. We need to hear about Jesus, dawdling just a bit. We need to hear that Jesus, in order to come to Lazarus, needs to come down into Judea, back into that space that he had fled not too long ago. We need to hear his disciples expressing concern. We need to hear that Lazarus dies. And indeed, that whole thing about 4 days, that it was actually quite hopeless. You see, in that culture, there was an understanding or a belief that somehow the soul stuck around for 2 or 3 days, typically 3 days. And that just to see if maybe there might be some life. But this whole thing of being dead for 4 days, well, that meant that all hope was lost. We need to hear in this story about how Mary and Martha before her have enough relationship with Jesus that they can come out and almost accuse him. If you had been here, our brother would not have died. But then there's Martha's statement of faith. But even now I know that God will do whatever you ask him. We need to hear about Jesus coming and seeing the people weeping and all that sense of lost hope and the ways that it deeply disturbs him. At least that's how it gets translated. It actually is much more like he became quite angry at the way that they were behaving. We need to hear about the way in which Jesus calls them to roll the stone away. And indeed, that after weeping, he calls Lazarus out of the tomb. We need to hear all of that to hear what comes next. And it's what comes next that is what got a hold of this bride and groom. Because in this, when Jesus says to the crowd, to Mary and Martha and to the disciples who were gathered around, and in fact to all those Jews who had come to help Mary and Martha to mourn, when Jesus speaks to them, unbind him, let him go. This couple, this bride and groom, started to recognize that in their life, each and every one of those people who were going to be at their wedding as they spoke their vows had been people who had spoken to them and enacted with them ways that opened up their life, that had unbound them, that had freed them to embrace the surprise of the emerging relationship, the promise of new life in relationship together as a couple. That indeed, this word of Jesus to the gathered community was a word that this community who would gather with them at their wedding had enacted already for them. Unbind them. Let them go. So it is for us. Through the waters of our baptism, indeed, God has already enacted new life, has already worked freedom and forgiveness. However, in the same way, we need to be unbound and let go as well, that we may live into the freedom of what God has already enacted. And so, in so many ways, my invitation to you is to spend just a moment, think about who it is in your life. Who is it who has spoken a word or lived in such a way or acted in such a way with you that you have experienced unbinding, new freedom, freedom to live into the truth that God and God's love has already freed you for new life. But more so, it's beyond that. In what ways? Who in your family or in the community of this congregation or in the community at large, who is it who is bound by whatever it is that holds them in the grip of a death even though they live? Who is it that you are called to speak God's grace, God's love, God's presence, or enact it by your presence with them? Who is it who needs the truth of God's freeing grace that they may live? Who is it that Jesus is calling to you? Unbind him and let him go, so that God's glory may be revealed.